Hello everyone. Hello. Welcome to the next class on modern history. Today we are going to discuss the Government of India Act 1919, which is also known as the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms, and the Government of India Act 1935. So let us start with the Government of India Act 1990. Before we begin, please like this video, share it amongst your friends, subscribe to this channel. We are going to put up videos on the entire modern history and the rest of the SSC CGL syllabus as well. So stay tuned. Put your doubts, write down your doubts in the comment section below. Mention your valuable suggestions and all you need from us in the comment section below. Let us begin. The Government of India Act 1919. As usual, we've seen the trend that the British government was trying to involve Indians in the Indian administration ever since the Sepoy Mutiny occurred in 1857. Why was it so? Because the Britishers had already understood that it was impossible to rule over Indians without the involvement of Indians in the Indian administration. Therefore, they slowly and diplomatically started involving Indians in the Indian administration. Montagu-Chelmsford reforms was based on the report of Edwin Samuel Montague, who was the then Secretary of State for India, and Lord Chelmsford, who was then Viceroy and Governor General. Hence, this reform is called the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, or simply Montfort reforms. Let us have an insight to what this reform is about. On the 17th day of August 1917, Lord Montague addressed the House of the Commons, and he made an announcement that was regarding the goal of constitutional advancement in India. He said that the constitutional advancement in India would be a gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government as an integral part of British Empire. The last few words of the sentence is a part of the exact statement, which is also known as the Montague Statement. And this statement, this declaration, this announcement of Lord Montague on the 17th day of August 1917 in the House of Commons with regard to the goal of constitutional advancement in India is famously known as the August Declaration. Okay, so what is the August Declaration? Write your answers in the comment section below. Also, watch till the end. Like this video if you haven't liked as yet. Subscribe to this channel right away. The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms was laid down in 1918, and it had a fourfold formula. It had 4 stages. The first one was the introduction of local bodies such as municipalities, taluks, district boards, etc. The second was partial introduction of government in the provincial regions, like in the field of provincial administration. Third, introduction of more Indians in the Legislative Council, and that is enlargement of the Indian Legislative Council, and certain relaxations with respect to the control of the Parliament and the Secretary of State with regard to the Indian administration. Now we are going to discuss some key provisions which are extremely important. There are a few sides to this. Firstly, it was with regard to the provincial government, and secondly with central government. Under provincial government, we will study the executive side and the provincial legislature. Under the central government, we are going to study the central legislature and the central executive. So let us start with the central government. Okay, the central legislative. Now the Viceroy's Executive Council was expanded, and the number of Indians was made 3 in a council of 8. So in a council of 8 members, 3 were to be Indians. The viceroy was given the chief executive authority. There were two lists, central and provincial. You know, can you tell me which of the provisions of the constitution directly um, mimics, like it reminds you of which part of the Indian constitution? These parts, can you write them in the comment section below? Let's check how much you're prepared with Indian polity before I take over Indian polity, which is going to be really soon. So there were two lists of for administration, central and provincial. The central subjects included defense, foreign affairs, post, telegraphs, and the provincial subjects included public health, local self government, education, law, agriculture, etc. And all besides, any subject it was not specially transferred to the provinces belonged to the central subject, like it was considered under the central subject, while the Governor General had the full control over the reserved subjects in the provinces. The Governor General was given the power to restore the certain cuts in the grants, to certify bills rejected by central legislature. The Governor General could issue ordinances. The central legislature, this was the introduction of bicameral legislature at the center. My question to you is, which part of the Indian constitution can you relate this with? So what is the bicameral legislature now? There was to be a lower house, also known as the Central Legislative Assembly, with a capacity of 145 members, and the upper house, that is the Council of States, with 60 members. Now let me give you a little reminder. If you remember about the system of Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha that you studied on the Indian polity, which is right now prevalent in India, write down what is the capacity of Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, and also write down the number of members from the different states in the comment section below. Let me check how attentive you are. The Council of States had a tenure of 5 years, and the Central Legislative Assembly, which is the lower house, had a term period of 3 years. Okay. The legislators could ask questions, supplementary questions, and they had all the power. And they had the power to vote in the budget. Their power was 30%, and 70% of the budget was still non-votable. Okay. This is with respect to the Indians. Now, elections and franchisee. Under this act, the franchisee was restricted. The universal adult franchise, the adult suffrage, there was no universal adult franchise. What is the universal adult franchise? What do you know about today's elections? Who is the current Chief Election Commissioner of India? Write your answers in the comment section below. Now, the qualifications for voting were laid down. Let's check out what were they. Either the voter must have some specific titles, or they should hold certain offices in the local body, or they must have had past experiences in the legislative council, or they must have had a property with rental value, taxable income, or at least paid land revenue of rupees 3,000 a year, or they should have a membership of Universal Senate. Now this act also provided a very important establishment, that is of the Public Service Commission in India, for the first time in the year 1926. So in the year 1926, this act provided that that India must have a Public Service Commission established. Likewise, the first Public Service Commission, which was established on October 1926. Once again, it was the demand of the Indian politicians that they wanted the Indian civil service to be Indianized, and hence they were demanding such reforms. Now, the Act also made certain reforms, that a statutory commission was to be set up after every 10 years after the Act was passed, and this statutory commission will have the task bestowed upon them to inquire the working of the government, of the system of government, the government that was being introduced in the country. Likewise, such a statutory commission was the Simon Commission of 1927, which was definitely an outcome of this provision. Also, home charges were to be paid from British Exchequer. So we know that during this period of colonial rule, there was a wealth drain going on. Like the money was going on from India to Great Britain, and one of such ways by which the brain drain was occurring was home charges. What do you know about the home charges? I can tell you one thing, that by this act of 1919, the home charges were dispensed with from they were spent from the Indian funds. The next is provincial government. We start with the provincial legislature. The provincial legislative councils were now further expanded, okay, to involve more Indians into the council, 70% of whom were to be elected and 20% nominated, 10 were to be non-officials. The election system was made direct from the prevalent indirect elections. The primary voters were electing the members. Once again, there were rules that would allow the people to vote. Women were allowed to vote, and the legislative council had a few powers. They could initiate legislation, but the legislative assembly was still a lower house, so therefore the governor's assent was required. They could have veto bills, and they could issue ordinances. This act for the first time separated provincial budget from the central budget, and there were this authorized the provincial legislature to enact their own budgets. The provincial governments could now have their own budgets. 70% of the budget was still non-votable, while 30% was votable. Just like the central government system. Okay, the next is executive side. Now we see the diarchy was introduced. There were two sets of government. One who was non-accountable to the legislature, one set, and the next set was who were accountable to the legislature. The set of government that were accountable to the legislature were known as executive councillors, while there were popular ministers who were accountable to the legislature. So the non-accountable members belonged to the executive councillors, and the members who were accountable to the legislature were popular ministers, and the governor was the head of this province, was head of the two sets of governments. Okay, now there were under the legislative subjects there were two lists: reserve list and transferred list, much like the central subjects and provincial subjects in the central executive under the central government. So the reserve list here consisted of law and order, revenue, irrigation, etc. This was administered by the governor with the help of his executive councillors. The transferred list contained education, health, local government, public work, exercise, and this was administered by the popular ministers who were nominated by the governor from the elected representatives of the legislative council. Now, the popular ministers who were accountable to the legislature, they were responsible to the legislature, and they had this no confidence motion system. Like if the legislature passed a no confidence motion against them, they were forced to resign. Whereas the executive councillors were not responsible to the legislature. They did not have any such no confidence motion system to be to be administered against them. Okay. Now, the Secretary of State and Viceroy could interfere with respect to the reserved subject, but their scope of interference was limited with respect to the transferred subject. Lastly, This act included a considerable majority of Indians, but there were a few drawbacks. The viceroy was responsible for the Indian administration, but he was responsible only to London. Okay, in the provinces there were two parallel governments administering different subjects, and it was somewhat illogical. The International Congress declared that these reforms were disappointing, they were unsatisfactory. They demanded effective self governance in India. The next most important act, and the last one of this era, last most important act of this crown rule, is the Government of India Act 1935. This act has 321 sections and 10 schedules. This was the longest act that was passed by the British Parliament. It was split into two parts: the Government of India Act 1935 and the British Government of Burma Act 1935. We are going to discuss the Government of India Act 1935 in this video. The Government of India Act was derived, has its origin in a few key sources. First is the Simon Commission, next the Third Roundtable Conference, the White Paper of 1933, and the reports of the Joint Select Committee. These are four very important sources. First, the report of the Simon Commission. Second, discussions of at the third roundtable discussions. Can you tell me who was the Indian who was present at all the three roundtable conferences? Write your answers in the comment section below. Next is the White Paper of 1933, and third is the report of the Joint Select Committee. Now, this act introduced diarchy at the center. While diarchy was prevalent in the provinces previously, now diarchy was introduced in the center. There was an All India Federation. Was introduced. In the provinces, the diarchy system was replaced by provincial autonomy. There were threefold division of powers. Indian Council was abolished. The British Parliament was given supremacy. Burma was separated from India. Let us understand what the All India Federation is. The All India Federation included 11 provinces of British India. It included the Chief Commissioners provinces and those of the princely states. Okay. However, this federation was not exactly practically implemented, because almost 50% was the minimum requirement of the princely states who were required to join the federation, but they chose not to join the federation. So this was not exactly enacted at the end. Now, diarchy at the center means these federal subjects at the center was divided into reserved list and transferred list. Now, earlier there was this central subjects and provincial subjects. Now there were two lists: reserved list and transfer list. These were to be administered by the Governor General, and with his discretion, it was to be the help of the three councillors appointed by him was to be taken. They were not responsible to the legislature. Next, the federal legislature. There was to be two houses, like bicameral legislature still prevalent. That is the Council of States, which is the upper house and a permanent body. 1/3 of the membership retiring every third year, composed of 260 members. 156 were British representatives, and 104 were members of princely states. 156 were representatives of British India, and 104 were members of the princely states. Okay, out of the 156 members of the British India, 150 were to be elected on communal basis, while 6 were to be nominated by the Governor General. These 6 were to be amongst women, minorities, and depressed classes. We see the introduction of reservation system that is prevalent in the Indian administration today. And the next is the representatives, that is 104 representatives from the princely states. This distribution of seat was done based on certain relative importances. They were to be nominated by their respective rulers. Next is the Federal Assembly, which is the lower house. It has the tenure of 5 years. There were 375 members. 250 were to be from the British India, and maximum of 125 members from the princely states. The seats were reserved for the princely states were to be filled by certain nominated members, and that if provinces had had their different criterions regarding the number of seats. Election to the Federal Assembly was once again indirect. The term was 5 years, but as today's prevalence system, it can be dissolved early. It could be dissolved earlier as well, but with respect to certain conditions. Now, the provincial autonomy. What is the provincial autonomy? We see in the provinces, the diarchy was replaced by the provincial autonomy. So, the provincial autonomy had two meanings. The provincial governments. The act also divided the powers between the central and the provinces. There were three lists: federal list, provincial list, and concurrent list. The federal list was meant for the center. It had 59 items. Provincial list were made for the provinces. That had 54 items, while the concurrent list were made for both central and provinces, had 36 items. There were certain residuary powers which were vested upon the viceroy. The provincial governors also retained certain reserve powers. There were separate powers given to the provincial governors with respect to their provinces. So these were the degree of autonomy. Basically, the provincial governors were given certain rights with respect to certain reserve powers. Now there were safeguards and reservations. Now, they were either imposed on the exercise of powers by the government of India or of the provinces, which basically had on the undesirable tendencies. No, there are not much important points regarding this. We will talk about this in some other lecture. Now, the federal court was established. It had one chief justice and not more than 6 judges. They had the exclusive power of original jurisdiction. They could decide on disputes among the central and the constituent units. There were provisions of filing appeals from Supreme Court to the Federal Court and from Federal Court to the Privy Council. So you see the hierarchy. That is, now we have lower courts, high courts, that Supreme Court. So at that time, there were high courts to the Federal Court, from Federal Court to the Privy Council. Okay, the Indian Council was abolished by the Government of India Act 1858. The Secretary of State for India had its own team of advisors in the place of the Indian Council. The franchisee was expanded to 14% of the total population who got the voting rights based on certain important criterions. A railway authority was introduced, which was called the Federal Railway Authority. It had 7 members. They were free from the Council of Ministers and Councillors. It was directly under the Governor General. The provinces were reorganized, some were geographically reorganized. Okay, Sindh was separated from Bombay. Bihar and Orissa were split into separate provinces. Burma was separated from India. Aden was detached from India and was established as a new colony. And the last important point is the separation of Burma. Burma was separated from India. Burma Roundtable Conference was held in London in 1932, and finally in 1935 the act was passed which separated India from Burma, and this separation finally took place in 1937. The Government of India Act 1935 established a new Burma office and made Burma a separate colony, but the Secretary of State for India was only responsible for the separate colony of Burma. He headed both the departments and he was known as the Secretary of State for India and Burma. The first Secretary of State for India and Burma was Lord Dundas, and however you pronounce it, it is Dundas. Since it is a popular noun, can be pronounced in any way. Are you aware of what a popular noun is? If you are, write your answers in the comment section below. Also write down if you remember who was the first Secretary of State for India and Burma. I just said that. Write your answer in the comment section below. Like and share this video. Comment your answers, your views, your opinions in the comment section. We are coming up with lots of interesting stuff ahead. Stay tuned and subscribe to this channel. Thank you.